Do you like mysteries? To wander through the enigmatic mist of the inexplicable? Great. I'm Merc, and here you'll find what you're looking for. Welcome to my domains. The truth dissolves into the mist.
The aviation industry has a secret, a ghost story it tried to bury. Kit begins not in the dark of the Everglades, but in the gleaming age of progress. The early 1970s, the era of the jumbo jet. These were the cathedrals of the skies, machines so advanced, so powerful, they seemed to defy the very concept of failure. And on December 29, 1972, one of these cathedrals stood on the tarmac of John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York. It was a Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, registration number N310EA, and it was a marvel. The Whisperliner, they called it, state-of-the-art, the kind of plane that made you feel like the future had finally arrived. Its flight that night was Eastern Airlines Flight 401, a routine red-eye to Miami International Airport. For the 163 passengers settling into their seats, it was the beginning of a holiday, a chance to escape the bitter New York winter for the warm promise of Florida. They were businessmen, families, honeymooners. Among them was a couple married just 20 days, returning from spending Christmas with family. They had no idea that their future was about to collide with a past that hadn't even happened yet. In the cockpit sat three of the most experienced men in the sky. Captain Robert Loft, a 55-year-old veteran with 32 years and nearly 30,000 flight hours under his belt. This was his domain. Beside him, First Officer Albert Stockstill, and in the jump seat, Flight Engineer Don Repo. They were the old guard, masters of a new machine. The flight departed at 9:20 p.m. It was, by all accounts, uneventful. For 3 hours, the L-1011 cruised smoothly through the night, a silent testament to engineering genius. As the flight began its descent into Miami, the city lights sparkled on the horizon. A normal landing, a routine end to a routine flight. But then, at 11:32 p.m., it happened. A tiny, insignificant glitch. First Officer Stockstill lowered the landing gear, the massive wheels locking into place for touchdown. But the indicator light for the nose gear, the small green light that confirms the front wheel is down and locked, remained stubbornly dark. A minor annoyance. Probably just a burned-out bulb. To be safe, Captain Loft aborted the landing. Air traffic control cleared them to climb back to 2,000 feet and circle west over the dark expanse of the Florida Everglades while the crew investigated. It was a delay, nothing more. The passengers felt the plane climb, the engines humming as they turned away from the airport. They looked out the windows, but there was nothing to see, just the absolute, primordial blackness of one of the most desolate places on earth. Inside the cockpit, the focus narrowed. 3 highly trained men, their entire attention consumed by a single light bulb that cost less than $1. They removed the light assembly. Flight Engineer Repo climbed down into the avionics bay, a cramped compartment beneath the flight deck known as the hellhole, to try and visually confirm the gear was down through a small porthole. Captain Loft leaned over to help, his hand resting on the control yoke. In that moment, a subtle, almost imperceptible movement, a slight pressure on the yoke, enough to disengage the autopilot's altitude hold, enough to set a chain of events in motion that no one in that cockpit would feel. Sitto, the plane, now flying on autopilot in a different mode, began a descent so gradual it was imperceptible to the human inner ear. 100 feet, then 200. The crew, deep in the bowels of the plane or with their heads down in the cockpit, never saw it. They never felt it. The Everglades below began to rise, inch by inch, foot by foot, to to meet them. In the cabin, one passenger felt a strange unease. He looked out the window and saw the distant glow of the Miami Tower, but it seemed to be getting higher, not lower. He knew the flight path. He knew they should be holding steady. He looked for a flight attendant, but saw no one. The unease grew. The silence in the cabin was deafening. At 11:41 p.m., 50 seconds after the last routine radio call, First Officer Stockstill looked up at his altimeter. What he saw sent ice through his veins. The plane was at 900 feet, not 2,000. The Everglades were no longer a distant void. They were a wall, rushing up at them at nearly 230 miles per hour. "We did something to the altitude," he said. Captain Loft, confused, looked up. "What? We're still at 2,000 feet, right?" The next words were a jolt of pure terror. "Hey!" Loft shouted. "What's happening here?" There was no time for an answer. There was no time for anything. Less than 10 seconds later, the left wing tip of the Eastern Airlines TriStar slashed through the sawgrass. The engines dug into the muck. The fuselage, a tube of steel and aluminum carrying 176 souls, ripped apart across the black swamp. The sound of tearing metal, the scream of twisting steel, the cries of the dying, all swallowed by the endless, indifferent Everglades. When the world went silent again, the plane was gone. And in its place, scattered across a mile of swamp, was only wreckage and the moans of the survivors. 101 people died that night. Captain Bob Loft, trapped in the wreckage of his cockpit, died before rescuers could reach him. Flight engineer Don Repo was pulled from the twisted hellhole alive, but succumbed to his injuries later. Their bodies were taken from that swamp. But what if something else came back with the wreckage? In the aftermath of the crash, Eastern Airlines faced a grim accounting. The L1011 N310EA was a total loss, scattered across the Everglades. But its components, its parts, were still valuable. In the hangars of Eastern, a quiet, pragmatic decision was made. Anything that survived the crash that was still serviceable, still functional, was salvaged. Avionics, interior panels, ovens from the galley, even seats. They were cleaned up, tested, and quietly installed on other L-1011s in the fleet. It was standard procedure, efficient, economical. Why let perfectly good parts go to waste? It was just hardware, metal, and wiring. There was no reason to think it was anything else. But, not long after the salvage operation began, the whispers started. First, it was a flight attendant on an L1011 bound for Newark. She was preparing the galley for the meal service, her back to the cabin, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned and saw a man in an Eastern Airlines uniform. He was pale, his face gaunt. He didn't say a word. He simply stared at her, then vanished. She screamed. When she described the man to the captain, he went pale himself. She had just described Don Repo. Then it happened to a pilot. A senior captain, a man with decades of experience, a man not given to fantasy, was in the cockpit of another Eastern L-101, running through his pre-flight checklist. He looked up, and standing in the doorway was a man he recognized. It was Captain Bob Loft. The captain spoke to him, assuming he was the relief pilot. The figure, Captain Loft, simply smiled, offered a few words of reassurance, and then faded into thin air. The real pilot was so shaken he canceled the flight. The reports began to accumulate, each one more chilling than the last. A first-class passenger became hysterical when the man in the seat next to her, an Eastern employee who had been silent and unnaturally still the entire flight, simply dematerialized in front of her eyes. She identified him from a photo as Don Repo, conch. On another flight, a flight engineer, working alone in the avionics bay, the very hellhole where Repo had died, felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He spun around, but there was no one there. He heard a voice, clear as day, whisper a warning, "Watch out for fire on this airplane." The next day, a minor electrical fire broke out in that very same bay. Had it not been for the warning, for the crew's heightened awareness, it could have been catastrophic. The sightings were no longer whispers. They were a contagion spreading through the airline, and the pattern was undeniable. Every single sighting, every single apparition, happened on a plane that carried salvaged parts from the wreckage of Flight 401. The ghosts of Bob Loft and Don Repo weren't haunting a place. They were haunting the pieces of their own death. They had come back, not as vengeful spirits, but as guardians. Warnings from the other side. The question was, would anyone listen? Or would the ghosts of Flight 401 force the living to confront a truth they desperately wanted to deny? By early 1974, the situation inside Eastern Airlines had become untenable. The stories of spectral pilots and vanishing engineers were no longer just campfire tales told by nervous flight attendants. They had become a corporate liability. The reports were too numerous, too consistent, and coming from sources that the airline itself considered unimpeachable. Veteran pilots with spotless records, seasoned flight engineers, level-headed cabin crew who had never believed in the paranormal a day in their lives. They all told the same story. Captain Loft and Don Repo were back. The sightings grew more brazen, more impossible to ignore. In one of the most disturbing incidents, a flight captain was in the cockpit with his first officer, preparing for departure. They both saw a figure in the vacant flight engineer's seat. It was Don Repo. He was solid, three-dimensional, going through the motions of the pre-flight checklist, his hands moving over the controls as if he were still alive. The two pilots sat frozen, watching the ghost of their dead colleague work. When they finally mustered the courage to speak, the figure simply turned, looked at them with an expression of calm recognition, and vanished. In the cabin of another flight, a senior Eastern Airlines vice-president was deadheading, riding as a passenger. He struck up a conversation with a man in the seat next to him, a man he assumed was a pilot based on his uniform and his calm, authoritative demeanor. They spoke for several minutes about aviation, about the airline industry. The vice president later described the man as solid, real, a real person. It was only when the conversation ended and the man failed to reappear from the lavatory that the vice president began asking questions. He described the man he'd been speaking with. The description was a perfect match for Captain Bob Loft. The most terrifying accounts, however, came from the galley of another L-1011. A flight attendant opened the oven door to check on the meals. Staring back at her from the reflection on the stainless steel was not her own face, but the face of Don Repo. His skin was pale, his eyes dark and sunken. He spoke to her, his voice a hollow whisper that seemed to come from inside her own head. "There will never be another crash," he said. "We will not let it happen." She slammed the oven door shut, her heart pounding against her ribs. When she finally dared to look again, the face was gone. But his words, his promise, hung in the air like smoke. The message from the ghosts was always the same: protection, warning. They were not there to terrify, but to prevent. They appeared in moments of mechanical stress, during turbulent flights, always with a word of calm or a cryptic warning that later proved to be eerily prescient. It was as if the dead pilots were still on the clock, still performing their duties, still watching over the planes and the passengers they had died trying to save. The airline's management was in a state of panic. Frank Borman, the CEO, a former NASA astronaut and one of the most respected men in American business, publicly dismissed the stories as garbage. He issued internal memos threatening to fire any employee caught spreading ghost stories. But behind closed doors, the concern was real. This wasn't a publicity stunt. This was a crisis of morale. Crews were becoming afraid to fly. They would check the tail numbers of the planes they were assigned to, refusing to board those known to carry parts from Flight 401. The atmosphere was one of dread. The ghosts were costing the airline money. They were costing the airline control. The turning point came when a scheduled flight was cancelled outright. The captain, a man with the ultimate authority on his aircraft, refused to take off. He had seen something, or felt something, in that cockpit that broke his nerve. The airline could no longer afford to ignore the impossible. So, they did the only thing they could. Quietly, without any public announcement, without any admission of guilt or belief, Eastern Airlines began a secret operation. Teams of mechanics were dispatched to every L1011 in the fleet. Their orders were simple, but the implications were staggering. Find every single part that had been salvaged from the wreckage of N310EA, every galley oven, every avionics module, every seat, every panel, and remove it. Strip the ghosts from the planes. The operation took months. Piece by piece, the hardware of death was carefully extracted from the living aircraft, and as each part was removed, the sightings stopped. The flight engineer in the hellhole felt no more cold hands on his shoulder. The pilots saw no more phantom figures in the jump seat. The ovens reflected only the faces of the living. The fleet was exorcised, not with holy water, but with wrenches and screwdrivers. The salvaged parts were destroyed or locked away in warehouses far from the skies they had haunted. By 1975, the haunting of Eastern Airlines was over. The stories faded from the daily operations, becoming just another part of aviation lore. A cautionary tale whispered in crew lounges. But the question remains, and it's a question that has haunted skeptics and believers alike for 50 years. If it was all a mass delusion, a case of collective hysteria brought on by grief and suggestion, then why did it stop? Why did hundreds of reliable witnesses, from vice-presidents to seasoned pilots, all stop seeing ghosts at the exact moment the airline removed those specific, salvaged parts? If the parts were just hardware, just metal and wiring, why did their removal act like a switch, turning off the paranormal activity as surely as flipping a breaker? The official story, the one the airline and the skeptics cling to, is that it was all nonsense, that there were no ghosts, that the tales were the product of overactive imaginations and a desire for a good story. But that explanation requires us to believe that every single witness was either lying or delusional. It requires us to ignore the pattern. It requires us to forget that these were not hysterical passengers, but some of the most highly trained, lunging, and rational professionals in the world. The other explanation is far more unsettling. It suggests that consciousness, or something like it, can survive death, that it can cling to the physical world, not to places, but to objects, that Don Repo, trapped in the hellhole as the plane disintegrated around him, somehow bonded with the very metal of that plane, that when that metal was scattered and reused, it carried a piece of him with it, a piece that was still on duty, still watching, still warning. The salvaged parts are gone. The L-1011s have been retired. But somewhere, in a museum archive in South Florida, an original floorboard from Flight 401 still exists, a silent piece of evidence, a witness to the disaster, and a reminder that some things, once broken, can never truly be repaired. Curse. The last sighting, according to the unofficial record, was just before the parts were all removed. A flight engineer, settling into his seat, felt a calm presence behind him. He didn't turn. He didn't need to. He heard a familiar voice, the voice of Don Repo, whisper one final message. It wasn't a warning this time. It was a goodbye. "Don't worry," the voice said. "We're going now. We'll watch over you from somewhere else." And then silence. The ghosts of Flight 401 had finally landed. The mystery, however, remains in the air forever, waiting for someone to look up and wonder.
Did you like this mystery? And What is your theory? Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoyed it, then like and share. I'm Merc, and I'll be waiting for you in the next mystery.